Bonjour, je m'appelle Benoît Desti. Je suis membre du conseil d'administration du Réseau canadien des centres de données de recherche, aussi directeur académique du Centre interuniversitaire québécois de statistiques sociales et professeur titulaire au département d'économie appliquée de HEC Montréal. Ça, c'est seulement dans mes temps libres. Il me fait plaisir de souhaiter la bienvenue à tous nos participants canadiens et internationaux. Nous sommes très heureux que vous soyez des nôtres pour cette conférence virtuelle du RCCDR, présentée en partenariat avec Statistique Canada. Today, the spotlight is on income and employment. We are delighted to have four panelists who will share their experience of how the CRDCN is advancing their research and informing policy. They will also discuss their aspirations for future data, research and or policy development as part of this week's series, looking back and looking forward, the impact of CRDCN research. Each of our panelists will present opening remarks of 6-7 minutes, as this portion of the kickoff has been pre-recorded. We invite you to submit your questions as you listen to each speaker, and we'll get to as many of them as possible in the live Q&A that will follow. I would now like to invite Jennifer Robson, Associate Professor of Political Management at Carleton University, to kick off today's panel.
Merci Benoît. Ça me fait un grand plaisir et franchement un honneur de faire partie de cette session. This is a session on policy impact of research, and personally I get a little bit anxious talking about the impact of my work as though there's a causal link. So I would like to couch everything that I'm going to say as examples of contribution to ongoing policy discussions. I have two examples of my past work using CRCDN data that I would like to talk about today. And one is a story about research that we had a really hard time getting published. So I call it a story of dashed hopes to dashboard. And the other is a story about engaging with community organizations who saw something on the ground that we didn't have a way yet to measure. And that I think is a story about moving from anecdote to counts and hopefully even better methods. And I'll end both of these stories with some questions for policy that I personally think are worthwhile and really need more research where RDC data is going to be critical. My research is broadly about household finances and how households, especially those with lower and modest incomes, interact with tax and transfer policy. This is a screenshot of a paper that I did with David Rothwell on asset poverty in Canada. We have lots of metrics in this country for income poverty that tell us something about the income available to meet absolute or relative consumption. But in addition to income flows, households also have stocks of assets, financial and physical, that they can and do use to meet their needs. So David and I took a conceptual definition of asset poverty from work by Haveman and Wolf in the US and looked at the data for Canada. This took us about 5 years and more than one journal rejection to finally get published, but persistence sometimes pays off. At the time, I think it was unusual and maybe controversial to say that a household with assets less than a given threshold should be considered at risk, even if they had a decent or adequate level of income. But I am pleased to say that this paper was cited in the government's National Poverty Reduction Strategy released in mid-2018. And asset poverty is actually now one of the indicators used by Statistics Canada for their national dashboard on poverty reduction. Here you can see it's actually being reported as the inverse of the number of Canadians who are not asset poor. Canada is, to the best of my knowledge, the first country to adopt this as a domestic indicator. In terms of relevance to policy, thinking about very recent experience, when COVID hit and shutdowns were ordered, new benefits were rolled out very quickly. And I think it mattered to know that just over a third of working age adults don't have enough liquid savings to live on, even at the poverty line, even just for 1 month. And so a short-term interruption of income, like a short-term shutdown during a pandemic, will leave a lot of them in dire straits. And in normal times, looking ahead, in normal times, not all unemployed people apply for EI, and there are a variety of reasons. Looking ahead, I wonder whether we will find that asset poverty predicted COVID benefit use, particularly in cases where the layoff ended up being temporary and the person might not have been expected in normal times to have applied for EI. Moving to story number 2, this is a paper that I've done with Saul Schwartz that is in the current issue of Canadian Public Policy, and again, relied on the RDC. If you talk to NGOs across the country who do volunteer tax clinics, they will tell you that they see people every year who suddenly get thousands of dollars in benefits, like child benefits, Canada Workers Benefit, etc., when they finally catch up on their tax returns. And if you're thinking in terms of cost-benefit analysis, you might be asking, why wouldn't you file a tax return if you knew that you could get thousands of dollars in benefits? The NGOs that I was talking to couldn't point to any official statistics of eligible non-participation in those benefits. Those are published in other countries, but we didn't have them here. And likewise, we couldn't point to any existing data on non-filing of tax returns. So this paper aimed to fill that gap by using a particular variable flagging success in matching survey records to T1 returns and treating this as an indicator of clear filing and potential non-filing. And we find that substantial shares of Canadians, especially youth at just over 22% and working age adults at 12%, don't seem to have a tax return on file. This has implications for how we match and use administrative data, and I understand that Statistics Canada has been investing in a much richer record matching environment. And it also has implications for policy. If we think that the tax systems should be used to distribute, for example, a basic income, whether as a one-off in a pandemic, as was recommended several months ago, or as an ongoing, whether, for example, like a targeted negative income tax, how does that work when an important share of the population that you're trying to reach doesn't necessarily file a tax return? Looking ahead to next tax season and the reconciliation of emergency benefits, could non-filing potentially go up? I'd just like to close by saying it has been 10 years since I started my first research project at the Carleton U of O RDC. I am indebted to the network and to the analysts who staff the RDC. Having worked with researchers and struggled with data access issues and quality in the US, the Netherlands, and international organizations, the RDC network really is quite unique. It's a real asset for Canadian social research and for research that can inform and contribute to better policy. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Jennifer. Je trouve que le premier papier, c'est un excellent exemple de comment la recherche informe la politique publique. Pour le deuxième, de note personnelle, je voulais recommander un article récemment sur les non-filers à quelqu'un, mais je me rappelais plus la référence. Et là, en voyant le titre, là, ça m'a soudainement rappelé c'était quoi la référence. Donc, merci beaucoup d'avoir rafraîchi ma mémoire. Me fait maintenant plaisir d'inviter mon collègue, ami, confrère, Pierre-Carl Michaud, professeur titulaire au département d'économie appliquée de HEC Montréal et titulaire de la chaire de recherche sur les enjeux économiques intergénérationnels, à prendre la parole. Pierre-Carl, c'est à toi.
Merci, Benoît. J'attendais de voir si Benoît allait faire une joke ou non. C'est souvent son habitude. Il m'a bien présenté. Excellent. Je vais commencer par dire que je pense qu'il n'y a personne qui va venir vous parler aujourd'hui puis qui va vous dire que les CDR ont pas été importants dans leur vie de recherche. Tout le monde va vous dire que ça a sûrement eu un impact majeur, non seulement sur leur recherche, mais aussi pour leurs étudiants. Moi-même, au début des années 2000, là, quand je finissais ma maîtrise, il fallait être vraiment chanceux pour pouvoir travailler sur des données canadiennes, surtout des données administratives. Il y en a certains qui réussissaient à le faire, mais clairement, c'était difficile de définir un projet de recherche qui allait utiliser des données canadiennes puis qui allait pouvoir être publié dans des revues internationales. Les étudiants, très souvent, faisaient des mémoires, des thèses en utilisant des données d'ailleurs, très souvent américaines, quelquefois européennes. Et donc, le Canada traînait de la patte, c'est mon évaluation, en termes d'exploitation de ces données, soit les données qui existaient déjà, les données administratives ou les données qui étaient collectées à travers les enquêtes. Il y avait peu de modèles pour les jeunes chercheurs, les modèles de chercheurs qui utilisaient des données canadiennes. Donc, la plupart des chercheurs qu'on regardait à cette époque-là étaient des chercheurs qui utilisaient des données qui venaient d'ailleurs. Donc, il ne faut pas sous-estimer l'impact qu'a eu les CDR sur la recherche tant en économique que dans d'autres domaines au Canada. À mon retour au Québec en 2010, les choses avaient grandement changé. Et maintenant, on pourrait dire que le Canada est un leader en termes d'accès aux données au niveau mondial. Et probablement que les CDR ont un rôle important à jouer là-dedans. Le CDR, bien sûr, a facilité l'accès, ça tout le monde va en parler. Mais je pense qu'il est important de noter aussi, c'est que les CDR ont permis d'être plus agressifs en termes de projets de recherche qui utilisaient des données sensibles en ayant une infrastructure stable, reconnue, robuste. Ça a permis aux chercheurs de demander à ce que soient libérées des données qui peut-être auparavant n'auraient pas été libérées à cause de ces problèmes. Donc, mon équipe a grandement bénéficié de cette infrastructure-là. Deux exemples peut-être de recherche où on a utilisé énormément les données des CDR et comme Jennifer, je dirais que je pense qu'il faut être humble quand on dit qu'on a peut-être influencé la politique. Le premier, ça serait le développement du modèle Simul qui a été fait à la chaire, en particulier quand Jean-Yves Duclos était encore dans le monde académique. Donc, on a travaillé ensemble durement pour monter un modèle de microsimulation qui permettait autant de regarder les finances publiques, mais aussi des sujets comme la retraite. Donc, en particulier, quand était le temps de bonifier le RPC, le régime de pension du Canada, on a certainement produit plusieurs articles de recherche qui utilisaient abondamment les données provenant des CDR et qui servaient d'input dans des outils de modélisation que nous avions à la chaire. Récemment, un bel exemple, l'utilisation de la DAL, donc la banque de données longitudinale de Statistique Canada à travers les RDC pour regarder les décisions de début de la rente de RPC, RRQ. Donc, publié récemment à l'IRPP, mais il y a une tonne d'autres articles que je pourrais mentionner. Puis, je pense que c'est surtout la production des étudiants. Je regardais récemment qu'il y avait plus de 15 étudiants de maîtrise seulement dans les 5 dernières années dans notre équipe qui avaient produit des mémoires qui utilisaient des données des CDR. Donc, ça, je pense que ça témoigne là, de l'importance de ces données-là pour la culture de recherche et pour la relève. Sur le marché du travail et santé, on a regardé énormément le lien entre inégalité et santé et surtout en termes de chocs, sur l'impact que les chocs sur le marché du travail peuvent avoir sur la santé en utilisant l'ELIA. Et puis ça, je pense que quand je présente ça à mes collègues au niveau international, les gens sont toujours épatés de voir le genre de données qu'on a réussi à créer au Canada en jumelant des données administratives avec des données d'enquête, ce qui est assez unique et ce qui permet de regarder à des sujets comme ça en utilisant l'historique de revenus des gens qui proviennent souvent des fichiers d'impôt et puis la santé qui est mesurée dans des enquêtes qui est plus difficilement mesurable par les fichiers administratifs. En termes de nouvelles réalités et opportunités, je pense que c'est important de noter, puis peut-être pour la discussion, que le monde est plus complexe qu'il l'était. C'est facile à dire, mais aussi plus hétérogène. Étant un moment dans le temps en termes dynamiques, en termes de trajectoire. Et ça, je pense que ça va être un défi pour l'infrastructure de données de recherche dans les années à venir, d'être capable de répondre aux besoins en termes de compréhension. L'analyse du marché du travail des revenus, je crois, ne peut plus ignorer les finances personnelles. Donc, je pense qu'il va falloir commencer à réfléchir davantage à comment mesurer bien l'épargne conjointement avec les revenus et le marché du travail dans un contexte dynamique longitudinal. Je pense que bien, peut-être heureusement, on ne taxe pas la richesse au Canada, donc on n'a pas de données administratives sur la richesse, mais je pense qu'il va falloir commencer à collecter des données d'enquête de manière longitudinale sur ces sujets-là. Je pense surtout, puis c'est toujours ce que fait un chercheur en terminant, peut-être étant donné qu'on a tout le monde, de faire un peu son wish list de qu'est-ce qui pourrait être intéressant à regarder dans le futur. Et je pense que les plateformes d'enquête pour la communauté scientifique, c'est vraiment l'avenir. Il y a des panels comme le LIST aux Pays-Bas et le American Life Panel aux États-Unis qui permettent aux chercheurs de s'appuyer sur une infrastructure de recherche de données administratives, mais d'y aller de leur propre enquête pour venir complémenter dans des zones grises où il manque de l'information. Et ces données-là peuvent être partagées à travers les chercheurs. Donc, je pense que ça devrait faire partie de la stratégie à long terme. Donc, je vais terminer là-dessus. Je trouve que c'est important de célébrer les CDR et tout ce qu'ils ont accompli. Et on va leur souhaiter encore, on va souhaiter au réseau longue vie.
Merci beaucoup, Pierre-Carl. Donc, moi, je serais d'accord avec toi que l'accès aux données s'est amélioré au Canada avec le réseau. Mais on n'est pas dans une situation statique. Les autres pays continuent de s'améliorer et je pense qu'il y a des développements intéressants sur la facilité d'accès aux données qui vont être annoncés prochainement par à la fois le réseau et Statistique Canada. Et l'autre point que je remarque, c'est que quelque part, l'attractivité du réseau vient aussi du type de données qui sont rendues accessibles aux chercheurs et que on parle de données administratives, on parle de panels, comme tu disais. Donc, ça va être intéressant de voir les autres développements qu'ils peuvent avoir à ce niveau-là. Our next speaker is Tammy Sherl, professor of economics at Wilfrid Laurier University and an associate editor of the journal Canadian Public Policy. Tammy, over to you.
Thank you, Benoit. Getting everything up on the screen here. And thank you everyone for having me here today. I really enjoy taking part in panels like this because it gives me a chance to reflect on things I've done in the past, and I usually walk away feeling really good about that. Now, when looking at themes in my own research over the past couple of decades, I've always been interested in the dynamics that we see within households, in determining each partner's time in paid and unpaid labor. And I'm interested in expanding my research there, which will require a lot more time in the RDC in the coming years. Now, my earliest example is the work I did while I was still a student at UBC nearly 2 decades ago. I recall sitting with Kevin Milligan, who was a fresh new prof at the time, and he was questioning why the labor force participation rates of older men had started increasing after the mid-1990s. A lot of people thought it merely reflected improving labor market opportunities overall, but I wondered if these guys just didn't like staying at home while their wives were still out working, which we wouldn't have seen with any earlier generations. Now, if I tried to link the husbands and wives in our labor force survey in today's public use files, this project would be entirely impossible. But I got to be among those first students getting access to the RDC in the early 2000s, where I could link spouses in the labor force survey and see so much more detail about them. And so I think this paper and what I got to do here really represents the value of the RDC in those early days, allowing that broader access to these confidential files outside of Ottawa. Now, fast forward 20 years, I find I'm still working quite a bit with Kevin Milligan, but now we're getting access to administrative data that we get to use in the RDC. Now, this graph comes from a recent project where we got to use the Canada Pension Plan's administrative data to map out how much longer people can expect to live after age 50 as it relates to their earnings, with ventile 1 here being people with the lowest mid-career earnings and 20 being the highest. And for men, that's the orange dots here, we saw a clear positive relationship between life expectancy and earnings, but not as much for women. Now, for these older birth cohorts of women, for instance, those born in the 1920s, we would have loved to link the women to their husband's earnings and see if that relationship mattered at all. We would have also loved to know more about all of them, but as with most administrative data, the information is quite limited. So I thought this would be a great example of how the value of the RDC has expanded over the past 2 decades, but it's also a key limitation of the administrative data itself. Now, going forward, I've considered returning to old questions and trying to make use of things like the longitudinal administrative database, which is basically our tax files. We have many years to help us think about the dynamics in joint retirement decisions and an amazing amount of information. But then I returned to this really basic equation that I wanted to start with, and there's this X for characteristics that we think matter for the participation decision, things like education or an individual's health. And you won't find any of that in the LAD. So I have left that on my shelf to think about for another day down the road. Now, what else is on my shelf? I get to think about what I want to do down the road. I thought I'd add some examples here. I'd like to map out whether women are still acting as added workers in a family, taking on that work to supplement the family income, for instance, when a husband gets laid off, and characterize who does that. But the labor force survey only gives us 6 months to look at household dynamics, and I think I need to know more about their past and even their future when we look at that point in time when things happen to really answer these types of questions. I'd also like to think a lot more about caregivers. This is really an important issue in recent months. And while the General Social Survey has some interesting cycles, I know nothing about the careers that caregivers may have left to take on that work or the long-term implications of taking on that work for their careers down the road. I also want to look more closely at how women are planning their careers around motherhood and how this changes with each new cohort of moms and new policies that have come about over the years. And again, we need to see what people are doing over a very long period of time to tackle these types of questions. So that takes me to where I think the future value of the RDC is, with Statistics Canada at work, of course. In recent years, we've seen amazing efforts to create linkages between some of our administrative data and the survey files that we have. And this has created excellent opportunities for researchers. And as this becomes more common practice, I think we can start designing surveys with this in mind. You could imagine doing a short, very focused survey on caregiving, knowing that the information in those tax files will be linked to it, making things much easier for respondents while getting researchers a great amount of information they need to answer their important questions. And I'm very hopeful that we can move in this direction. I really look forward to the research that I get to do over the next 20 years in this regard. Thank you.
So thank you, Tammy. You made me think about my own labor supply as I get older and my future retirement. But then talking about linking data sets made me all excited again. So maybe I won't retire tomorrow. I'll work a couple more years to see all those nice new data sets. Our final speaker, Lynn Bartelford, is Assistant Chief Statistician of the Social Health and Labor Statistics field at Statistics Canada. Lynn has been a steadfast champion of CRDCN and will share her thoughts about how income and employment data available in the RDC has informed research policy over the last 2 decades. Over to you.
Thank you, Benoit, and I'm so happy to be here to celebrate 20 years of employment and income data in the CRDCN, to talk about how this has evolved, why this matters, and where this could go. Let's start with a little bit of the rich history. The roots of the current system of labor and income statistics date back to the 1976 redesign of the labor force survey. That year, the conceptual approach to defining labor force status was established and is still in use today. Using these core concepts, Statistics Canada has since built an impressive time series and a volume of microdata, with monthly data from 1976 through to present, all of which is available to researchers through public use microdata files and, importantly, the Research Data Center Network. The income series has undergone a few more dramatic changes and revisions over the years. The Survey of Consumer Finances, introduced in 1976, was replaced by the Longitudinal Survey of Labor and Income Dynamics in 1998, and then replaced by the Canadian Income Survey in 2012. And in the early 1990s, Statistics Canada began using tax data as a source of income information. Nowadays, about 90% of the records in the Canadian Income Survey are derived directly from income tax records. That said, the income concepts have remained constant, yielding a continuous annual income series from 1976 to the present. The Labor Force Survey and the Survey of Labor and Income Dynamics were among the first microdata files to be introduced into the research data centers in 2001. Since their introduction, labor and income statistics have been used to monitor trends and to answer key policy-related questions, many of which you just saw. Recently, CRDCN researchers have studied many topics, including the impact of full-day kindergarten on maternal labor supply, working past normal retirement age, wage inequality, and the interface between local labor market conditions and theft-related crime. To do all this work, researchers have accessed the survey data through the Research Data Center Network, often integrating survey data with other data sources in ways made possible because of the conceptually consistent and regular production of labor and income data. The COVID-19 crisis has certainly placed a spotlight on labor market data. The pandemic-induced economic shutdown created an impact on the labor market that is unprecedented. The chart you see before you shows the relative employment declines for each of the 3 previous economic slowdowns in terms of employment. Compared to the previous 3 major economic slowdowns, the COVID shutdown, shown in red, shows a much different pattern. This means that the policy responses that worked in previous recessions may not work the same way for the COVID-19 pandemic. So looking forward, it is clear that one area that CRDCN researchers can help is in studying and interpreting the unprecedented impact of COVID on Canadian society and providing context and expert advice for policymakers. The spotlight placed on the labor and income programs also shed light on some of their shortcomings. COVID-19 has highlighted the need for more disaggregated data for diverse population groups and the need for more timely data. The most recent available data from the Canadian Income Survey, for example, is for 2018. So addressing these challenges will take time and creativity, but the work has begun. As of July, the Labour Force Survey added questions on visible minority status groups, allowing disaggregation of diverse groups of Canadians. Other experimental work is ongoing to address data gaps for persons with disabilities and to track more recent trends in income. The labor and income programs are seeking to increase their relevance in the face of the pandemic. So looking forward, there are many opportunities. Statistics Canada has been working with its new social data linkage environment to build integrated databases using survey data linked with administrative data at the microdata level. Statistics Canada is also placing more linked files into the research data centers. Adding the longitudinal administrative database to the holdings, for example, led to more than 100 projects currently underway. In April, the Labour Force Survey launched several questions on its Fast Track supplement, aiming to get quick information on the impact of COVID on the labour market. This opens the possibility of more supplements to address issues of job quality or enhance the data available for the income program. L'enquête canadienne sur le revenu étudie la possibilité d'augmenter la taille de l'échantillon en l'intégrant davantage à l'enquête sur la population active et d'améliorer les estimations de revenus en utilisant davantage les bordereaux des données fiscales. De plus, le programme de revenus évalue des techniques avancées telles que le nowcasting pour fournir des estimations rapides de certaines statistiques sur les revenus. Et comme les prestations publiques aident les gens seulement s'ils y ont accès, Statistics Canada s'efforce de fournir des nouvelles estimations de taux d'utilisation des prestations. Tout cela pour dire que les programmes de travail et de revenus de Statistics Canada ont une histoire riche et un avenir prometteur. L'utilisation continue de ces données à des fins de recherche contribue à renforcer la pertinence du programme statistique. Les chercheurs ont un rôle important à jouer dans l'utilisation de ces données et la démonstration de leur pertinence sur les politiques. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you again to all the participants. Maybe you got scared by when you got the list of everything that is being done right now in the RDC, but be reassured there is plenty left to do. You can steal a few ideas from Tammy's last slide, or you can contact me, Jennifer, or Pierre-Carl for more ideas. This concludes the pre-recorded portion of this spotlight on income and employment. We invite you to please stand by as we transition to the live Q&A session with our panelists. If you have yet to do so, please submit your questions. The live Q&A is starting now. I'd like to thank CRDCN for this short musical interlude that gave me time to get a haircut and change. Let's start. Welcome to the Q&A session of this part of the CRDCN20. And let's jump right in with a question for Jennifer. Everyone has a favorite story, I guess, but what data challenges do you face when you use administrative data in your research?
My goodness. Okay. So what data challenges do I face? So I would say there are a few. Obviously, one is that the administrative data is not necessarily always set up and organized to be clean and easily ready for analysis. So there's just always more work that is involved in terms of actually doing the data organizing and resetting. And then number two, I would say is, and this was something actually that Lynn mentioned briefly, the frequency sometimes of the administrative data, because it's annual, because there's often delays in making it available. One of the frustrations is often using administrative data that you worry is maybe not as timely as it could be. So I guess those are two that I would say.
Thank you very much. Well, we have to be prudent on how you complain, because everybody's complaining about getting more administrative data. When you get it, we complain that it's not good enough, but we want it even if it's not good. Tammy, what should data owners do to better enable data linking and integration?
So I suppose that depends on who the data owners are. That's a pretty broad term, and there's lots of different groups, both private and public, who are going to be the data owners, including many people who are just running their own surveys. I think that regardless of who is collecting the data, having some key pieces of information that allow you to identify individuals in a consistent way across data sets. So in Canada, the most consistent thing we can find is a social insurance number. Not everybody has one, but at least you can get across some data sets. So having something like that, but also making sure that you get permission to link across data sets from the people that you're collecting information from. You can't just get it and ignore what they want you to do with the data. I think that's just respecting people. And then of course you need to be able to hold it to maintain their privacy in a secure way, especially if you're going to start trying to link it across data sets. Now what we can expect governments to do, well, we can just hope that they're going to cooperate and appreciate how much research can be done, even sometimes when that research isn't obviously valuable at the moment. It might be down, 5 years down the road when you have a pandemic. Maybe you want to know something about caregiving. This can be helpful. So I think those are just key ingredients. Is just first permission, and then having some identifiers to be able to make those linkages easier.
Pierre-Carl, do you want to add something to that?
I talk about other potential problems with admin data that Jennifer mentioned, not to add problems, but I think in the RDCs, we need to make sure we have the computing facility capacity in order to open up some of these data sets. So I just think about the LAD or others. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to use. We need to use all sorts of tricks in order to exploit the data that are perhaps not as efficient. And in terms of data linkage, as Tammy mentioned, I think what's key is having some sort of identifier across data sets that allow new projects to develop perhaps linkages that perhaps were not thought of at the start. And I think there StatCan and the RDCs are doing a great job. I know for myself with StatCan, there's a lot of openness towards potential new projects. And I think that's the way to go. It's not always key point here is it's not always best for StatCan to think of what should be merged. I think there's a good back and forth that needs to happen, and I think it's happening right now. And I think it's this is the way to go if we want to create innovative research.
Thank you, Pierre-Carl. It just wouldn't feel right to have a question about linkage and not let Lynn say something about that. So,
thank you, Benoit. You must have sensed my desire as well to chime in. My colleagues have certainly talked about some of the fundamental necessities, if you will, for good administrative linked data sets as well to survey data. I guess what I would like to add to that is the importance of standards in building data sets. So that the integration of these data sets works well across their various entities. The adherence to national standards is really quite key. I would also like to let the listeners just share for a moment some of the really innovative work that is going on through the use of what we call our social data linkage environment at Statistics Canada. This is a very privacy secure environment where we are able to bring together multiple data sets, sometimes even in a customized fashion for particular research projects. For example, work with some colleagues at UBC is underway around putting together social assistance administrative data with tax data, with census data, for example, to explore some of the possibilities. So there is some very innovative work going on there, but it is key to have those identifiers, to have those standards, and to think about the way in which these data can be used going forward.
Thank you, Lynn. And just because I'm a nice guy, I won't follow up with a question about how you feel with some provinces not following national guidelines and sharing data. I'll keep that for later time. But since I have you now, I wanted to ask you, what are the couple of key takeaways for StatCan regarding the value of income and employment data during such moments as national economic uncertainties, such as COVID-19?
I think, Benoit, the role that the Canadian research community has to play in grappling with some of the impact questions, not only now, but into the future, is one of the key takeaways. And in order to do that, it means that the data have to be available and accessible for this kind of research. So at Statistics Canada, and we've been very responsive and innovative in the recent months, trying to make sure that we're able to produce different types of data and the data that researchers are going to need to examine these main questions going forward. And I'll point to the labor force survey as a key example. It has been the flagship of measuring the labor market impact of COVID-19 and will continue to be so as we move through the recovery phase. And some of the supplemental information we've been able to add to that, like experiencing financial difficulties, take up of CERB benefits, working from home, and so forth, will be of a keen value to researchers going forward, I believe. So strong role for researchers to play.
Yeah, and I guess one issue is collecting the data, and during a pandemic, the other issue is sharing the data with researchers. That could be more complicated as well.
Yes, I think it's really important to thank Canadians, because even in the most difficult of circumstances, we still have thousands of Canadians participating in our data collection endeavor. So a big shout out to the Canadian community.
Sure. Let's do part of a roundtable. I'd like to know what lessons you have all learned about how to best connect research results to policy. And let's start with Tammy. There was a...
Not sure I invited myself there to move and be noticed. How to connect your research results to policy is kind of a tricky thing when you're in academics. You know, I've reached that point in the career where I don't have to worry about tenure and promotion and these kinds of things, but other people do. And so it's hard to balance that kind of policy engagement where you're out talking to people and doing, you know, short policy briefs and meetings and these kind of things to present that research to the people who are using it versus, you know, early career, you really need to get those publications into the best journals possible to keep your job, right? So you need to get past that first hurdle if you want to continue on doing the policy work. It's a bit of a juggling act that I think is really challenging, but I do take those opportunities, you know, to talk to people at conferences and now in webinars, these types of things whenever possible. As much as being on Twitter can seem like a time-sucking waste of time, it also connects me with a lot of people that, you know, both in the media and policy and the general public that I wouldn't otherwise talk to every day in presenting some of the research and, you know, just general things that we want to look at in the data. So I think there's that scope for just general engagement, trying to talk to people and being available. But I also recognize that limitation on time when you're in those more junior stages, and it's difficult to balance out.
But does it make you sad to see a trade-off between being policy involved when you're a young researcher and doing the criteria for now that you're tenured, it's time to complain about it.
I'm tenured. I know I complained about it before that. I think it's actually really important that departments recognize the full value of what their researchers are doing. And I've generally described that as part of service. You know, if you're doing policy related research, it's part of our job as public servants to share that research and have it be used as much as possible. But you really need to push your committees in your departments to recognize that as something valuable. I've tried to do that. I think our department actually does a pretty good job of it for the most part. But I know a lot of departments really struggle with that. So that makes me a bit sad.
And I can't help seeing Jennifer nodding. So I guess, do you have a few words to say about that as well?
I do. And so I just want to echo a whole bunch of what, and just agree wholeheartedly with a whole bunch of what Tammy said. I guess maybe one thing that I would add is just some lessons that I've learned over the years in terms of how to do a better job of presenting research results in a way that actually can be useful for policymakers and policy folks. The first obviously is that issue of the venue of the publication, right? That as academics and as researchers, we definitely value the journal publications, but quite often policymakers, that's just not where they're going to go. It's kind of an impenetrable obstacle. So to the extent that you can find ways to share your research findings in other venues, yeah, I know Twitter does look like a terrible time suck a lot of the time, but I'm grateful for it because I have learned so much from other Canadian researchers and really benefited from their willingness to share results. And the last thing that I would just say, I guess, in terms of communicating research, I think policymakers really appreciate honesty about what you know and what you don't know. And that there's some humility, right, in recognizing that any study that we do is like, it's one study, it's one piece of, it's one data point, and so there are still a lot of unknowns, but also being willing to help policymakers draw that through line to what are the implications, what are the practical implications for how to better understand a problem that they're grappling with, how to better evaluate various options for how policy might respond, and how to, do things like understand the impacts of policy directions that they're already pursuing. So just being more explicit and helping them draw some of those through lines, I think is often very meaningful for them.
Thank you. Pierre-Carl?
Yes, I think the trade-off Tammy mentioned in what we could hope for shouldn't really exist. We should find ways such that the best researchers who produce some of the best evidence are supported in terms of translating their research to policy makers and to the public in general. And I think it's a hard time. It's a hard time, for example, for researchers to make things simple and clear in a way that doesn't look to them as if it's too simple and too self-evident in some way. So you need good research communicators, and that's actually something that is perhaps still missing, at least in my infrastructure, and in others we're trying to help with that, but we don't need just good people that are good at communication, but people that are good at understanding research and identifying with the researcher the value. And I think perhaps the RDCs at some point, or the network, could think about doing that. And I think that would be a good way of supporting also young researchers, so that we beat this idea that it's actually a trade-off. It shouldn't be. And it should be a win-win situation when you engage in policy relevant work. It should also be at the frontier in terms of the rigor of the academic work. And I think it's when we deviate from this that we get in dangerous zones, both on the academic side as well as on the policy side.
And finally, Lynn, since StatCan is part of the government, I guess, maybe it's easier for StatCan research to make its way to inform policy, or do you see challenges there, or do you see challenges in research being done with, in getting research being done on StatCan data set to policymakers?
Well, like my colleagues, even a national statistical agency isn't immune from the need to do really solid knowledge translation of findings and so forth. And I point to the importance of partnership and how valuable that can be to team up with the academic research community to have that engagement towards knowledge translation. I think that is a very positive thing. But many times what we're really aiming for is writing through different ways, appreciating the different formats, the different mechanisms like Twitter and other mechanisms that are available, and really appreciating the audience for which one is writing. Not all audiences are the same or are necessarily interested in the same pieces of the information. So like my colleagues, we work really hard in the knowledge translation, and we really benefit from having great colleagues in our communications area that help us out.
Thank you. Tammy, so Pierre-Carl was mentioning earlier that many students were using RDC projects for their master, and it was a good training ground opportunities, and they were able to learn and prepare for their career. Do you get the same feeling about the usefulness of projects and RDCs as a training activities?
I think it makes sense as part of training activity just to become familiar with how to use these types of large data sets and also the security around them, and being able to work with that. I mean, that's certainly how I was introduced to all of this many years ago now, but it's certainly useful. I think part of the challenge there for many universities is that some of our programs are quite short in length, and so planning these types of training activities for shorter programs like a one-year master's degree can be very, very challenging. Or for instance, if a student in their master's degree comes up with a fabulous idea that they want to pursue, it's going to take a long time to go through the process of entering the RDC, then becoming more familiar with the data, especially the administrative data, and working with it before they finish their degree. And so we have short timelines on degrees, but a very lengthy process for training. And so, there's clear value in entering that process early if you're a PhD student. If you have a chance to be an RA and get into an RDC, do it. And similarly for master's programs, if you have those opportunities to take them. But it's very difficult, I think, for students to take on their own independent research in a short time frame with the setup that we have.
And maybe we should have they're becoming more and more popular in the US, those pre-doctoral programs where students get through the RDC accreditation process and then they can start their PhD program. Jennifer, I saw you nodding again, so maybe you want to add something about that?
Oh, I was just going to agree with so I teach in a one-year master's program, and so it's a real challenge, right, for students. Like that's just not enough. That's just not enough runway for them to be able to get through the RDC. But again, as Tammy says, if you get a chance to get into the RDC as an RA, if you're a PhD student, I mean that's how I got started. Well, was PhD research, but it's a terrific training ground if you have the time to be able to give to it.
We'll now move to a question from the participants, and I guess I know the answer to that question. It's a question for Lynn. Maybe more specific examples of issues with administrative data regarding documentation, changes over time, and the data variables. I guess you're trying to minimize those at StatCan, but I guess that happens.
It's I'm glad to have that question, so thank you for that. One of the keys to being able to use data in the research data centers is to have that flow of documentation and to have it be complete and precise and so forth. So at StatsCan, we're always very, very keenly aware of that need. And so when we get feedback in areas for improvement, we listen very carefully. One of the strengths of the labor force information and the income information in the RDCs, for example, is that continuity in terms of concepts. So even though sometimes there are changes to the survey instruments or administrative data, our subject matter experts pay a lot of attention to the consistency in the concepts and to having those explanatory pieces accompanying them. And as we're always here as well to answer questions and to explore with researchers when there are considerations that are conceptual in nature and when it may appear that there are challenges to dealing with documentation or consistency. So I want folks to know they can reach out to us and we can certainly provide answers.
Okay, thank you. Here's a okay. I don't know about that question. We learned that data is useful to inform public policy, but looks like some people think that data can be also misapplied. So what should we do to combat the misapplication of research, especially the ones that have open interpretation? So maybe let's start with Lynn, since you're here. I see you full size on my screen, so you're kind of.
Sure. I think it is important to recognize that there's a proliferation of data these days and a proliferation of information sources, and not all are of the same quality. So things that that we look for, of course, as a research community are, you know, transparency in the methods, transparency in the nature of the data sources, full explanations around the findings and caveats and so forth. Those are really important considerations. And being clear right up front on where those data come from. I say to even my own kids who do work, I said, first most important thing you need to do is think about the source of the information, and the value of having a research data community like we have through the research data centers is that valued, trusted source of information.
Anyone else wants to add something about that? Oh, Tammy.
I sometimes wonder when we think about the misapplication of data, if often that is a communication problem more than anything else. I think we've seen a few examples, perhaps because I'm on Twitter, where, you know, we see results coming out from a study and it's not always clear to people how to think about things like identification strategies and what causal inferences versus just correlations. And people, you know, they're often looking for, you know, ways to dismiss a research study. So thinking about what is credible and peer-reviewed, what is not peer-reviewed, what kind of, you know, process goes into creating the estimates that we get, that's sometimes a much more difficult piece to communicate. And I think sometimes people don't necessarily know the difference between, you know, a really neat identification strategy that gets you at a clear effect of a policy versus, you know, policy X happened and this other thing happened over there. Should we think they have anything to do with each other? So I think part of the problem there is just also a communication problem with research.
Jennifer, Pierre-Carl? No? I thought somebody would mention, but because that's one problem with confidential data, ensuring that replication is possible. So not everybody has access to the data. So that's one issue for CRDCN to work on, how to make the work done in the lab replicable, or maybe CRDCN has to do that job, or maybe since the Canadian Economic Association has a new data editor, maybe it could be the new data editor that will solve that. I have one question for Jennifer. If you could make one new data available in the RDC as a way to advance work on income and employment, what would it be? Christmas hasn't been cancelled yet, so it's your opportunity to ask for your Christmas gift.
Right. Okay. So yes, we're still hoping to salvage Christmas, right? So I think one thing that we have definitely learned in the last couple of months dealing with COVID is the fact that people's financial situations can change very rapidly, and their employment situations can change very rapidly, and that there's actually a lot of volatility. So that monthly LFS data has been really great. It's absolutely essential. What I would love to see, though, is actually more frequent data sets for some of the in-year differences in terms of people's incomes and some of the fluctuations that we see. Right now, like, Canada has really, really great annual income data, but what we're not able to see is enough of what happens from one month to the next. So my Christmas wish would be for that within year and frankly, even from administrative sources within your data.
And I realized I just said Christmas. Obviously, I meant for the holidays. So the holidays haven't been canceled. Pierre-Carl, what do you want for the holidays?
I'd like us to think a bit more about some data that we used to collect and that we're collecting a little bit less, which is, I'll call it subjective expectation data or well-being data. I think we've been making great strides in terms of admin data. But longitudinally, we've had some setbacks in terms of what we're collecting to accompany everything that we're doing, in particular in terms of health and in terms of well-being. So in particular situations, you know, if we want to estimate models, we want to know what people are thinking about income over the next year, over the next 6 months, and so on. And these expectation data have been shown to really predict well behavior. And so, so that's what I had in my intervention was a platform, proposing a platform so that researchers can add perhaps topical, perhaps more behavioral surveys to the admin data or to a platform so that this type of research could be done. It's really in fashion in the academic world. There's a lot of work that is being done either on saving, on income, and on labor, on using these data. So that would be on my wish list.
Well, I'm sorry, Pierre-Carl, this was the wrong answer. The correct answer was peace on earth. And Tammy, did you want to ask for something for the holidays?
Well, I do normally head to Winnipeg for my winter vacation. But we'll see about that this year. I think, you know, I'd love to see these linkages between the high frequency data and that longitudinal data that we have. You know, one of the things we're waiting to see next week is what's happening with moms and whether or not they're making it back to work in September, right? We all have our anecdotes around us. We saw evidence that they were having trouble getting back even as far as August. So what's going to happen with them? And so we're going to get some sense of that from the labor force survey, because that's our monthly survey. But I want to know whether they're giving up a job or a career, you know, and for that you need to be able to quickly link those files like the surveys and the LFS and everything very, very quickly to the longitudinal administrative database to get that bigger long-term picture. So I think my wish list would be, you know, just having a regular linkage like that ready to go in the RDC so that when researchers like me say, hey, what's going on, we can jump in very quickly and get right into it.
Thank you, Tammy. Lynn, I'm not asking you because you're at StatCan, so if you want data, you just create it, so that's not a big deal. But I do have another question for you. Somebody is asking what kind of tools you are using to combine qualitative and quantitative data.
Oh, great question. So we've been looking really, we've been looking a lot more closely at mixed methods and applying those within the Statistics Canada context. So we do a fair amount of qualitative kind of work when we're testing questionnaires, when we're doing focus groups and so forth. And so we've just very recently started looking at how would we do a better job going forward of using these kinds of mixed methods to add context and important narrative around some of the quantitative findings. One area that is not technically a qualitative necessarily by definition, but one new innovative tool that we've been using of late is our crowdsourcing. It is not a statistically representative tool by any stretch, but it is a very powerful one in the right context and used appropriately. So we've been reaching out to Canadians with some fundamental questions about COVID-19, for example, and having them participate to our online, come to our website, participate online, not as a probability sample, but a real conversation with Canadians. Our first one, we had 250,000 Canadians share their COVID-19 experiences with us. So in some ways, this is also consistent with our desire to explore more mixed methodologies in this regard.
All right, thank you, Lynn. I'd like to close now this session. I'd like to thank you all for your participation. I'd like to thank everyone who attended, and I'd like especially to invite you to be here with us tomorrow again to talk about education and social development. Donc, merci beaucoup à tout le monde et j'espère vous voir aussi Ben, ce ne sera pas moi le modérateur, là, mais j'espère vous voir aussi demain pour notre session sur l'éducation et le développement social. Donc, merci beaucoup à tout le monde. Au revoir.
Thank you.
Thank you.